I'm Melanie. I'm the project coordinator for Brace for AIDS, and I'm here to have a discussion on how we're preventing HIV and AIDS. One of the biggest things that we don't often talk about before we get to the stage where we're thinking about healthy sexuality is what happens before we meet someone and before we even start dating. So, the topic that we're going to talk about today is basically what are some things that we look for when we're even just meeting someone. I don't know if anyone has an experience they want to start with, or what they like when this topic comes to mind. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
So I feel like with dating nowadays, it's a conversation that should be had right away.
Mm-hmm.
It's not, but it's definitely something that we should be like. So, how many parties have you had?
Right.
Or when was your last, testing? Or it should be something that we're aware of from the beginning and not a surprise conversation
Absolutely.
a year later.
Exactly. Yeah. So even kind of like before you're even dating someone, in that stage where you're like maybe at a party or at a family dinner or maybe at church or wherever you are when you're meeting someone, like I guess I'm just trying to think of like what does that environment look like when you're even like kind of prospecting, like should I approach the person, and once you've made that initial contact, what are the things that are surrounding that? Because I feel like sometimes we're not talking enough about like, are we meeting our partners at clubs? Are we meeting them at church? Are we meeting them out in the community? Like, where are we meeting these people that I've heard a lot that it's kind of difficult to have those conversations about safety when we're talking about sex, right? So, and I'm just kind of curious as to like what everyone's experience is when it comes to where they are. Like, how do you meet someone, and what are some things that you look for when you are meeting someone?
So I think there's a misconception that if you meet someone in church, they're healthy and you don't really have to worry about their past because they're in church. And if you meet someone at a club or somewhere else, you know, maybe they've had a lot of sexual partners. So I don't really base where I meet the person.
Okay.
Like I don't base their health on where I meet them.
Okay.
Right?
Okay, that's a good point.
Yeah.
Anyone has any like in agreement to that? Maybe thinks something different in terms of.
I agree.
I grew up in the church as well, and I can definitely say, like, you don't know what that person is doing the rest of the week. You don't know how often they attend church, or whether they're even a religious person, let alone, like, what their life is outside of that. So,
right. Yeah.
You can't just make that
really
assumption about anyone.
Exactly. So, having said that, though, what are some things that we look for? Do we is there something about them? Is it like their energy? Is it the way that they talk to you? Like, are there nonverbals that we're looking out for? Like, give me an idea of like what you ideally might look for in someone in those stages.
Well, you know what? Being the age that I'm at right now, for me there's nothing to look for. Like,
okay.
If they're a sweet talker, or if they're good looking, if they have money, like your sexual health doesn't determine like what you do. You cannot look at someone based on what they do. Like I'm at the age now where I don't care what you do, what you have. I need to see the papers.
Okay.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so for me, because I'm older, it doesn't matter about that. If I want to get to know someone, I don't beat around the bush. I'm like, okay, so have you been tested?
Okay.
When was the last time you were tested?
Right.
And I want to see it for myself.
Okay.
And I know people's health information is private.
Yeah.
But if somebody wants to be in a relationship with me,
mm-hmm.
we have to go down to the clinic together.
Right.
I have to see the needle go in their arm.
Yeah.
I have to see the dates, and I have to go back and read the results to make sure that it's a legit results, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
So I guess from my experience talking to some people about this very same topic, I've gotten the sense that there are some women out there, and probably a lot of men too, who have brought the conversation up about using protection, and they get a lot of like resistance. Not like I'm good or I'm not really about that. So I guess I'm trying to take it also back before that stage happens, before you decide to even have sex with the person, right? So what does that conversation look like when you're getting to know someone, right? So like what is the quality of the conversation that we're having with potential partners, essentially, is kind of also what I wanted to talk about.
I find that for me, before I was married, the way that conversation goes is a big hint to me about whether or not that person is partner material.
Okay.
Like if they've never thought about it, or they think it's weird, or they're not comfortable talking about sex, I'm probably not the right partner for you anyway. So like we don't really get into that situation. When I met my partner, we were very open with each other about our histories and like our health histories and testing, and he knows that I used to be a sex educator and that I like this is all very important stuff to me, so he didn't try to pull any
Okay.
weird stuff with me because he knew that this is who I am.
Right. Okay. No, that's so important, because I think that's such a key thing. When you know what's important to you, right, and what those conversations look like. As you said, like sexual health is something that's important to you, and having that engagement with that person, I think, is really healthy and it's important. Because I think maybe I get a sense too that there could be situations where people are just talking about like very surfaced stuff, like, you know, how many friends, like where do you live, where do you work, like that doesn't really have an indication as to, is this a healthy person, is this a healthy partner for me to have. So what are some other things are like that you talk about that you kind of determine whether or not this is someone that you want to take it a step further and even have that conversation about being intimate with them?
I guess you can talk about their family,
Okay.
right? Their background, like kind of get a sense sometimes of how a person is, based on their relationships with their children, their family, or just friends, right? To just get a feel the type of person, and you can kind of tell on their character. But I mean, character again is not a tool used to judge someone on their sexual health. But for me, it's an indicator of kind of like, okay, how many partners have you had? How many kids do you have? Why, if they have a
Exactly.
lot, why do you have a lot of kids?
Right, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, no, you bring up a good point, because I think when you meet someone who is healthy, who is, you know, someone that is ideal in your mind as to someone that I want to have a relationship with, and you get a sense of how they are in a relationship with their family, with their friends, and when you talk about their character, right, in terms of, are they pushy, are they inclusive, do they give you that freedom to be who you are and to speak for yourself and to honor, like if you said that you don't like something, do they respect that? Are they respectful in general, right? Because I think when we look at sexual violence or people who are refusing to protect themselves when they're having sex, and that ultimately leads to HIV and AIDS, we talk about characters of people who are forceful, who are controlling, who don't honor or respect you. Could possibly be the case too, right? So I think those conversations are really, really important to have, and it's a really good thing that you mentioned, like, what are your other relationships look like, right? Because sometimes we miss those really key indicators. Because there's just so much. There's past trauma, there's family breakdown, there's dysfunction everywhere, and it's like, how do they handle that, right? So, yeah. So one of the things that I was wondering about is when we talk about our own safety physically, what about emotionally? So when you are meeting someone, do you feel emotionally safe enough to even like have that conversation, or are we checking in with ourselves rather when we're like before this conversation happens? Do you think?
Most of the time, no.
No. Why would you say?
Because you're so smitten, or you're in the moment, right? And when you're in the moment, you don't think logically. Not always.
Very true. Yeah. So you're kind of like caught up in the moment with like the vibes that's going on. Maybe they're really good looking, so you're just like into that.
Definitely, there's an emotional high that comes at the beginning of a relationship where, you know, in hindsight, you might be like, why was I so stupid? But in that moment, you're just so hooked into the relationship that you're not thinking about your own health or their health or anything beyond the next couple of hours,
That's
let
true.
alone like the rest of your life.
That's so true. Yeah, kind of getting caught up, like Usher said, right? So, I mean, and I think that's kind of where I was going in the very beginning of the conversation when I had said, what kinds of environments are we in? Because sometimes when there's alcohol and there's other, maybe presence of other drugs, does that affect that conversation too?
I think it can. I guess if there are drugs with alcohol, your ability to make the right decision is affected. And then after everything is done, you're like, oh my god, what happened? Right?
That's very true. I know culturally it's a huge norm that a lot of our get-togethers, like, there is alcohol there, right? I don't know about everybody else's, like, their environments and their, you know, their communities and what they do when they get together, but I know that that can also play a role when we talk about, are we drinking? Have we drank a little too much before we even decide that we're gonna get someone's number and exchange that conversation? So that's just a little something to think about, but kind of going back to kind of being caught up in the moment, what if like you're not in a good place? What about like being emotional, vulnerable?
Well, I can say this. I was married at one point. And I guess I was emotional and vulnerable with a lot of issues in a marriage, but at one point I said, I'm responsible for my health. You're not responsible for my health. And I told my then husband, I said, I don't trust you. And we're not sleeping together. I'm responsible for my health. And we had to put things in place and the marriage ended. But I made it very clear that I just didn't feel safe with him. And I was married to him. So we just stopped. I chose to not have sex with him anymore.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
But that was a big deal. Like, it took so much for me to realize I'm responsible for my health. No one else is. I am.
Absolutely.
And so if anything happens, it's because I wasn't responsible for my health.
That must have been tough because I mean, like when you're in a relationship, a serious relationship or a marriage, to even say no, kind of, I'm sure that must have felt very like difficult or awkward maybe because I guess there's this thing where when you're married, like you're kind of, well, you know, you kind of not have to, but like it's just a thing that.
Well, I felt pressured because I had to. But at just one point, I'm like, no.
Okay,
no,
good for you.
I am responsible for my health.
And you're so right, you are. Like even when you are in a committed relationship, right? It's not just new relationship. So yeah. No, thank you for sharing that. Yeah. So what about, are there any other like factors that play into like why we're not having that conversation maybe sometimes? Sometimes we're caught in the moment, sometimes maybe the environment.
I think it would be remiss to not bring up the issue of consent, because I think a lot of times, or not necessarily a lot of times, but I think that sometimes when you meet someone and you haven't made that decision, there can be coercion there. Whether it's about having sex with them at all, or whether it's about using a barrier method for protection. So if somebody is, you know, kind of an abusive, crappy person in the relationship to begin with, that's gonna continue along into the sexual part of the relationship and all the other parts of the relationship.
Completely agree. Yeah. So kind of like setting those boundaries outside of the bedroom.
Yeah, partly, but also, and I don't want to sound like I'm victim blaming, so I guess it's more like if you are a person that has had a violation of consent or have been in a relationship that was abusive, know that that wasn't your fault.
Right.
That was that person's decision to force that, and any health repercussions are ultimately the fault of the person who made you do that. So it's just something to kind of be aware of.
No, absolutely, because I think we kind of have to know ourselves, right? We have to know what we're okay with, what we're not okay with, whether we're talking about the sexual part or whether we're talking about just what happens within our own relationship, right? Like the way that you talk to me, the things that we do together, I think it's really important to make sure that you know that conversation is happening before we even talk about sex, right? Because it just makes it more comfortable, and you're respecting yourself. You are protecting your safety physically. You're protecting the other person's safety when you have these conversations initially. Yeah. So any other thoughts, kind of like on that?
I guess it's just maybe sometimes we don't know how to have the conversation or what to say. You know.
Mm-hmm. What would kind of like a question, like maybe give me like a scenario as to like what question would be difficult to pose, or what's
Like-
difficult about having that conversation?
It depends on how well you know the person,
Okay.
right? If you guys just met, let's say you're on date number 2,
Okay.
and you really want to know, you know, their stats and if you know if this person's safe.
Mm-hmm.
You just don't know what to say. How do you start the conversation? Do you just come outright and say, have you been tested for HIV? Or,
Mm-hmm.
you know, it can be an awkward conversation,
Okay.
right? And it can also turn your partner off depending on their maturity level.
Yeah. True.
Yeah.
That's true. Does anybody kind of have like an answer to that one? Any suggestions or?
I think for me, that kind of conversation just happened organically. That's actually a good question. Wow, I should have thought of that more before I started talking.
It is a good question.
I don't recall sitting down and being like, we need to talk about this specifically, but I know that we talked about it.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. It was like a formal, like, well, today, tomorrow, we'll talk about this.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was like we were having a conversation, and I happened to maybe mention like I was on my way to the doctor for my annual checkup and saw this on the street, or this happened, or whatever.
Right.
So like it's part of us talking. It doesn't necessarily have to be like a separate thing.
Okay. I dig that. Yeah, I like that. I think that's like letting the conversation happen really natural, and letting it flow and not putting so much pressure on the topic. I think that's a good point. I would say how to have the conversation. I mean, just asking in general about the person's history with other partners they've been with, like asking what that's like, maybe like asking them like to, you know, like, are you comfortable with protection, like just getting their viewpoints on it. I think kind of takes the pressure off, because I think if you come off the bat and just say, do you like,
Mm-hmm.
are you tested, like to just jump right into it, I think might make people a little repulsive, or like, whoa, okay, that's a little too much. So I think it's important to be very cautious and careful how we're introducing the topic. So I think like having letting the conversation flow naturally. I think also being inquisitive as to like what their past relationships look like and how they handle different situations. Maybe even sharing your own viewpoints on how you protect yourself, how you keep yourself healthy. You know, talking about how you maintain your health in general, and then kind of maybe throwing that piece in there about, well, you know, although when I'm in a committed relationship, I still test myself. I still check up at the doctors. I still make sure I'm good, because you never know, right? Just because you're in a consenting, loving relationship doesn't mean that things can happen and people may not slip up or, you know, fool around behind your back. There's so many scenarios that we can choose from. You just never know, right?
Or they
So
could have contracted something in a previous relationship and not even know
Mhm.
that that's happening.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think what helps me have any difficult conversation, and especially a conversation like this, I would imagine would be really difficult to have, is to think about kind of what you would say. To kind of think about what your answers may sound like or look like before you even get into the conversation with someone, getting a sense of, you know, what would I say if this topic comes up? Kind of formulating questions in your own mind beforehand, right? So kind of being prepared, rather, right? And you want to make sure that when you're having those conversations that you are in a good place, because as we kind of talked about a little bit before, that checking in with ourselves, like, are we ready emotionally to even have that conversation, right? Because based on a whole bunch of different factors, that could be a thing too, right? Any last thoughts kind of about like having the conversation with a potential partner, the things that we look for, things that we should be talking about.
I think it's just very important to have a conversation. I almost feel like they should be teaching us how to have this conversation in school, you know, when we're in high school, so that when we start dating, we know how to approach it and not feel uncomfortable. Because it's something that we should be talking about. You know,
Very
it's,
true.
it's reality. Everybody's doing it, but nobody's talking about it.
Right. Yeah.
So, yeah.
I mean, I kind of wonder, why are we not talking about it?
Yeah.
Why are we not having this conversation more often? Because we're talking about after the fact, after like you're kind of at that place where you're like ready to engage, but like what about taking it a step back and talking about like, well, what should I be looking for, and how can I be doing those preventative measures before I even get to that place. So another part of this conversation, in terms of how to even start the conversation and what kind of things are we talking about when we talk about healthy sexuality. So another part of that is, how do we have that conversation with our kids? What age do we start talking to our kids about sex? But before we kind of like dig right into that, because there's a lot to say about that, I kind of want to know, did our parents really talk to us about sex? Did that happen? What age did that happen at?
Never age 0.
Never happened.
So
Yeah.
wow, so none of our parents talked. Wow.
There's like a few different parts to that question.
Okay.
Because I grew up in the church where like the sexual messages about waiting till marriage was very, very clear. So we didn't really talk much about it at home. But on the other hand, my mom was a nurse. So she knew, like, she always taught us the correct names of body parts and all of these things. And like if I had a purely scientific question, I could ask her. But nothing about like my own life or dating or anyone that I was interested in. Just like, you know, how large is an average penis? And she'd tell me, and then that would be the end of the
That'd be it.
conversation. But like we wouldn't go into detail.
Okay. That is huge, because I completely am with you on that, in that growing up in the church, that was the conversation, was that it's a sin if you do it before marriage, or that it's wrong, it's something that's supposed to be kept sacred only for your husband. You're not supposed to engage in that. So really, I think that's probably why my parents or my mother didn't even have the conversation about sex, or about, you know, just my interaction with boys in general. So yeah, no, like that, I think that's a huge piece, because that actually, and I'm now realizing that, because like I thought it was just like a cultural thing, that like in my culture, in my home, we just don't talk about sex at all with our parents. But because you've mentioned the church part, like that's so important, that like it starts in places like that, right, where your beliefs come into play, on whether or not you even should have that conversation. Because I think that it's kind of looked at like, if you have the conversation with your kids about sex, then maybe it's like you're encouraging them to do it, or you're giving them permission to do it. So
Or they just don't know how to have the conversation. Maybe their parents never had the conversation with them, and they just ignore it.
that's true.
Yeah.
So that's another good point too. So maybe our parents didn't have the conversation with their parents, because they didn't really know how. Okay, that's a really good point.
Well, I want to say that my mom found that I started having sex. Well, I got pregnant. So I used to bring my friends to the house so they could put their pads in the garbage. And I think after a while I just got lazy, and I guess she noticed I wasn't having a period.
Wow.
And so that's how she found out
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Wow.
that I was having sex.
Okay, how did that, out of curiosity, if you don't mind sharing, how did that conversation go?
No, we never had the conversation.
Okay.
There was never a conversation. It was,
Okay.
I'm pregnant. And
Okay.
there was never a conversation after that.
Mm.
And that's,
I thought that maybe she would have like.
No.
Okay.
See, my mother's Jamaican.
Okay.
And the old school Jamaicans, they don't talk about that. My experience.
Okay.
So either you get beaten,
Mm.
or you get pregnant, or that's it. It's never a conversation.
Okay.
It's never ever a conversation. Maybe nowadays
Right.
with this generation it is.
Right.
But I think that's how she that's how my mother found out
Wow.
that I was
My goodness. Wow. Okay.
and how did I feel? I think I felt like I had this problem that I was pregnant, but then I had this other problem. How do I keep it a secret?
Hmm.
So I said, and then my friends didn't know why. Like after the fact, I would tell them, "Oh, you're on your period. Just wrap it up in tissue paper, not newspaper, because I wanted her to see that it was in the garbage. So I tried to keep it a secret as long as possible.
Right.
But then I only could do it for so long. Right.
Right. Yeah. I don't know. I would have imagined that you probably were full of fear that entire time that you had to like hide that.
I think I was afraid. I thought I was gonna get beaten. And I think I was there was so many emotions. I can't really remember at the time, but it was just it was if my mom had spoke to me, maybe I wouldn't have gotten in that situation, or maybe I could have done something else.
Wow.
And so I had to figure it out on my own. And yeah,
Wow.
and that's the first time I've told the story.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us.
That's the first time.
That's like a like I don't even know what to say.
Yeah.
Wow, that's really intense,
Yeah.
and that must have been a lot for you.
I think at the age I was, because I was young, I was a teenager. Not a young teenager, but almost close to 18.
Okay.
But I mean, I was in school and my family, and actually everyone in my family told me I was going to hell, and God is gonna blight me, and they're gonna give me a cup of water when I go to hell. So instead of having a conversation
Wow.
that hey, it's okay, because they all did what I did, but they never told me because I found out.
Okay.
So generational. So what I did, they did.
Interesting.
And maybe if they told me or we talked about it, it wouldn't have.
Exactly. Yeah. So that would have been a preventative measure, definitely on their part, to have that conversation.
And so now with my kids, because I have 2 adult children,
Mhm.
I've had the conversation probably like grade 9, I guess.
Mhm.
So I've had the conversation, and I still have the conversation. And then sometimes they're like, "What's wrong with her? What are you telling me? Like, what's wrong with you?"
Yeah.
But I do still remind them
Mhm.
or tell them stories or give them examples.
Absolutely, yeah. Because that job as parents, like that never ends. I think it's an ongoing conversation, right? Yeah. No, but thank you. Like you brought so many points to the forefront here
Yeah.
because you said that you were brought up in a Jamaican home, and I know the same for a lot of Caribbean homes. Myself included, like my family's from Guyana, and like that. Culturally, it's not something you do. Like you don't even have like permission to like speak or to feel anything, so much less to talk about sex and your body parts. Like that's not happening for sure. So I know for me, I had written in my diary about my first experience, and my mom went snooping around in my room and found it there, and then she told my father. All he did was give me a look, and that did it. Yeah, because he never beat me. My mom she was the aggressive one. But yeah, it was just you were in trouble, you got found out, and that was it. There's no discussion after. I was just told that like if I brought home a certain kind of guy, that my father would just be out of my life. So it's kind of like if I did something that was remotely close to that, forget it. Like you're not like me and our relationship is basically done. So I mean I don't know like what else kind of would happen if your parents found out that maybe you were having sex or curious about it. Were there other kind of like punishments or repercussions?
I mean, for me, I told my mom. I wasn't an adult, so I just felt like I could have the conversation with her. I cried when I told her. And she was like, well, it was going to happen someday. And it was just like, okay, it is what it is.
Yeah.
And we never talked about sex in my household growing up either.
Okay.
But I don't think that it really made my decision making any different. Because I had my own morals, my own personal things that I wanted to keep for myself. and so I just kept it. I was a little afraid, too, and I guess that comes with not knowing, but I just said when the time is right, I will, and I was an adult at that time.
Okay.
So yeah, I was never punished for losing my virginity or having sex or anything.
That's a really good thing.
Yeah.
That's a really good thing. So we kind of have like two opposites of the
Yeah.
of the story kind of thing.
But I want to say something else,
Mm-hmm.
and I've never repeated this because it's not my story. So I have a 18-year-old son, and I've been talking to my kids about sex and condoms and HIV and everything. And so my middle son, he kept saying, I have to go to the doctor, I have to go to the doctor. I'm like, it's okay, we could deal with it, we could fix it. And then he would be like, no, it's okay. And then so one day he said his girlfriend's pregnant.
Wow.
So I had to take a step back. I was mad, but I'm like, thank God he came to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to reflect on how I felt at that age, and he was able to come to me, and I was supportive. The girl as well, I was supportive. She didn't tell her parents, and it ended in a miscarriage. But I was able to guide them through the whole thing, and everyone came out in the end happy. I don't think anyone needs counseling, and I don't think that the girl will let it happen to her again, because I had to let her know, look what happened to your body.
Mm-hmm.
You were in the hospital, you had the procedure, not him.
Right.
Look at all the trauma that you put on yourself. You have to wear a condom.
Mm-hmm.
But they both came to me, and so it ended, I think it ended positively.
Okay.
And again, I've never talked about that. So with my kids, when I find out something, I have to take a step back and think when I was younger and how my mom treated me, and try to remember what I wanted to hear.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's no babies, I'm not a grandmother.
Okay, not yet.
Not yet.
Okay.
Too young.
Too young.
Okay. That's good, yeah. I kind of have like a similar experience too, where like I have a daughter, she's 17, and I think I started having the conversation with her. I don't even exactly remember the exact age. I just remember whenever she asked me or was curious about certain things, kind of like, where do babies come from? How does that happen? We kind of started having the conversation from early, probably as I would say maybe 10, 11. And as she got older, she became a lot more inquisitive about the process of like what actually happens. And kind of like what you're saying in terms of like thinking about how you felt when you were younger, how you would have wanted that conversation to go. I remember as a survivor of sexual abuse, my cousin was someone who felt that it was appropriate for him to teach me about sex physically. And so that was my introduction to sex. So I knew that I didn't want my daughter to have the source of that information in that kind of way, rather from anybody else other than me or her father. So I think that's a constant reminder is to like think about how you would have wanted that conversation to go down for those of us who didn't have a good healthy conversation or had a conversation at all with our parents. I think, what would I have wanted my mom to teach me? What would I want my mom to do or my dad to say to me in those moments? And so, we talk about age appropriate stuff, depending on exactly what we're talking about, right? There's so many different topics about sex we can talk about, but the last thing I want her to feel is shame about her body, so I let her know that it's normal that she's asking. What other things can we keep in mind when we're talking to our children, or maybe we have nieces or nephews or just people, maybe youth that we're influencing. What other things should we keep in mind when we're talking about sex with them when they're being kind of inquisitive and they want to know and they're looking to us as that resource for them?
Just keep in mind that you were also that age, and that they're asking because they're innocent and they don't know.
Mm-hmm.
So just to give them the information lightly.
Okay.
Yeah.
I agree. What else?
I don't have kids of my own. I do know that there are some really good books on the market for like if your child is a reader or if you're a nerd and you want to give them something to read. There's books like What Makes a Baby or Sex is a Funny Word. When my mom was an HIV educator, she often brought home like children's stuff that I was like in my teens, but I was always really interested in early childhood education and how that worked. So I would read through them and learn about like how people teach children about some of these topics that we might sometimes think are too mature for kids or stuff like that.
Yeah, no, that's such a good answer because it actually goes to show how creative we could be when we're giving information to our kids or other youth out there, to be creative, like, because it's not just like what we know, right? We could also provide resources. We could give them books, we can like show them educational videos maybe, or if you know someone who's like a sex educator, maybe like they can have the conversation with them. So like there's so many different ways that we can that we can have that conversation. It doesn't necessarily need to be only like a verbal, one-on-one conversation. So I'm loving that point that you bring about that.
I think in general, we should, for whoever have children, they should strive to have a good relationship with the child/children, so that when a situation does come up where you want to talk about sex, the child is not awkward. The child is not like, oh my God, why is mom talking to me about this? I don't want to talk to her. But if the conversation and the household is open and comfortable, it'll be like, oh, mom and dad are teaching me about this. Okay, I'm gonna take heed, sort of thing.
Yeah, no, that's such a good point. To have a good relationship with our kids. I would imagine that there might be people who would say, well, how do I do that? How do I have a good open, like, I don't know how to talk to my teenager. What would we say to people who think that way or who are not comfortable with to have that conversation with their teens? Because I feel like, and I know that there are a lot of parents who don't have good relationships with their teenagers or with their children.
Yeah, I mean, like she said earlier, there are so many books out there. So if a parent is feeling uncomfortable, maybe she should do some research on how to, and their answers.
Yeah. So kind of like self-education. So
Yeah.
seeking out the answer in whatever means that is available.
Yeah.
And I want to say to the parents, if you're gonna get a book, please get a book that's 2020, not 1979 like my mother did, and it was 1991,
Wow.
and the book was 1973. So please get a book that's in the current year, right? With the same style and the lingo.
I agree. Because
Yes.
I mean, your kids are not going to relate to like
Yes.
old
Has
stuff.
to be relatable.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's really important.
And there's always new like forms of birth control and different things coming out that weren't around when I was a kid. So I might think I know, but like if I haven't checked for 10 years or 20 years, then maybe I don't know what I think I know.
It's true. Yeah, and I'm sure it changes even sooner than that. Like the names of certain like diseases and certain, as you said, like different kinds of birth control. Like there's just the information is going so fast and it changes really quickly too that like we almost have to always make sure that we're like updated with our knowledge, right? Yeah. So that's what else kind of like what we have to keep in mind though, like when we're building relationships with our kids, our teenagers. Any thoughts on that?
I don't have teenagers yet, but I feel for me as a teenager, my mom never wanted to get on my level. And I didn't want her to act like a teenager, but I wanted her to sit down, just listen. Even if I was talking about something that was irrelevant, just sit down and listen.
Yeah.
So I think making the time, because some parents, they're in a single parent home, they don't have the time because they're working so many jobs. Making the time to sit down and talk, sit down and go to the movies, sit down have dinner, go out for a walk, do something that they like.
Mm-hmm.
That can open some doors. Maybe not right away, but
It's true.
yeah,
Yeah. So it's kind of like those really small.
it's like dating.
Exactly. Those small moments matter so much. Like
Yeah.
I remember this memory comes to me as you say that. When I was like trying so hard to like build this relationship with my daughter, and I was kind of just like feeling a little bit down about it. And I'm like, Leah, how come we don't like you don't tell me anything? And she's like, well, you don't come in my room. You don't come and ask me how I am. And I was like, oh, I
Yeah.
don't. Shoot.
Yeah.
I'm always asking her how school is, how her friends are. Like I'm asking like very like direct, but I'm not like really genuinely showing that I care about her and what's happening in her world. And I think that's kind of where it starts is like really trying to be inquisitive as to like what she's going through just on a regular day-to-day basis. So that I think that's huge. And I think a lot of parents they kind of take that for granted, that those small moments of like even something like, can I get you something to eat? Can I, are you thirsty? Like those little acts of kindness are huge when we're talking about building relationships with youth, because they want to know that first of all we care, not that we just want to know and be all up in their business and like no, thanks for sharing that, because I think that's huge.
Yeah, it's important. It's just laying down the foundation for them to feel comfortable to come to you whenever about whatever.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah. I know there's a huge, like, when you do build that relationship with your kids and you start to talk about sex, making sure that, I know for me, well, it's kind of like when we're talking about sexual violence and being a survivor, being a victim, and how the whole victim blaming thing happens, how you want to also prevent that when you're having that conversation about sex with your kids is to make sure that you're not putting the responsibility on them only to make sure that they're safe. What I mean when I say that is an example of that rather would be where a home, let's just say, where the father or like maybe uncles or males in the home are telling females, the female children, make sure you wear things that don't expose. Make sure you're not enticing the boys, enticing the men, because that sets the stage for a lot of different things, right? When we talk about shame and body image, and we talk about sex and whose responsibility is it to keep children safe and things like that, right? So when you're having that conversation about sex, making sure that your kids know that their bodies, nothing is wrong with their bodies. Like your body is made and created for a purpose, right? Instead of like always making it into something that's like kind of fearful and negative,
Yeah.
because then that just seems to be a lot of people's experience is that they look at sex like, oh, it's kind of shameful, disgusting, I don't want to talk about that. So I think that we have a huge part to play in that conversation as well.
I agree.
Are we comfortable having the conversation about sex with our kids? Like, because I think it was mentioned earlier that like our parents didn't have the conversation with their parents, and it's kind of a generational thing, right? Do you think that has to do with comfort?
Maybe. The other day, he's now 8. He just turned 8. He asked me where do babies come from, and I froze, and I was like, oh man, what do I say? And I said, from God. And then I was like, there's more to it, but when you get older, we'll have that conversation. Because I don't want to tell him that a stork brought him to me.
Right.
That's not the truth. Like I said, you're from God, and when you get older, I'll tell you the rest of it. Because I don't think it's for him as an 8-year-old, for me to tell him exactly what happens.
Right.
Because I think that's a bit much. Then he's gonna go to school and let everybody know, and then he's gonna become like the sex ed counselor at school.
At 8? Wow.
Right? So yeah, that was my take on that. But for sure, I will 100% talk to him about the real deal once
Nice.
he gets age appropriate.
Yeah, no, nice. Yeah. Yeah, because I think the way that you would talk about it with an 8-year-old obviously looks different when you're talking about it with an 11, 13,
Yeah.
16-year-old, right? Like
Yeah.
the content is very different.
Yeah.
I think I have a 10-year-old and it's kind of the same thing, except like it's a little bit more progressive now. Like
Yeah.
she's kind of asking about body parts and into learning about this kind of stuff in school as well. So you can't really hide it, because especially now, like when there's like music talking about things, like they see things on social media or in television, their friends, like you don't want your kids to like get that information elsewhere, right? So it's kind of like you're forced almost to have the conversation earlier than you're actually ready to, which kind of sucks a little bit, but yeah. So like maybe if they're like 12 or 13, maybe like talking about when two people love each other and they make that decision. You know, like baby grows inside the belly, and this is kind of where like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think everyone's comfort level is different. Everyone's gonna explain it differently. The way I would explain it to my daughter would be different from how you would explain it to your kids. So that there isn't really like a step by step, this is the right answer, this is the wrong answer. I think that we all kind of need to get to know our kids and what, you know, feels right for you and for them. That's kind of what I would say about the age appropriate thing too.
Yeah.
So like for me, I work in a hospital,
Okay.
so I see like the stories,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so one particular story, and I hope this is not TMI, but it was about a butt plug.
Okay.
And there was a situation where something happened, and I'm like, how did this person not know that if you don't use it the right way,
Oh.
you can end up in a merge?
Okay.
And so then because they weren't using a butt plug, you're using
Something
that kind of
else.
thing.
Sure. Yeah.
So, well, they were using a dildo,
Okay.
but you can't do that. I didn't know. I'm like, oh my god.
Yeah.
So I went home and told my kids, if you ever plan on using a butt plug on someone or yourself,
Mm-hmm.
you have to use this particular type, because if you don't, it could disappear, and then you have to go to merge, and then the entire department's gonna know. And so my kids are like, what are you telling me? But if they're in that situation, then they'll be like, hold on.
Remember when?
Yeah, because I'd rather them feel uncomfortable in front of me
Mm-hmm.
than in front of the entire emerge department, because we do talk about it, right?
Yeah, and I'm sure they don't want to feel the.
Yeah. And I know it's a weird conversation, but sometimes I find stuff and I'm like, oh my god, and my kids are older,
Yeah.
and I tell them, guess what, this is what I found out, and they feel uncomfortable, but so if they do end up in a merge, at least I told them
It
they
is
can't
true.
blame me.
You know, yeah, that's something I don't even hear very often, is talking about like sex toys.
Yeah,
Like when you have like kids who are like a little bit older.
And
like
even
my kids are
stepping-
adults.
And even stepping back from sex toys, the pleasure conversation
Mm.
as a whole. Like I remember growing up, I was told about sex with boys and why I shouldn't do it and why I should wait till I'm married. I was not told anything about LGBTQ, I wasn't told anything about masturbation, I wasn't told anything about sex toys, like good or bad. It was just, these are not things that exist in our world.
That's true.
So, yeah, I think a lot of people my age are probably flying a little bit blind with that conversation, because we didn't even have a bad one that we can like learn from. We just didn't have one at all.
Yeah.
It's like, how do I?
Yeah, that's true. Does that even exist? What kind of toy? What kind of toys? Yeah, no, I could imagine that conversation not happening either. Yeah, there's just so many things that sometimes parents can be really unaware of. So that's why I said like it's our responsibility now to make sure that we're kind of like updated and we're in the know of what's going on in our world and what are people doing, what are the trends, because it looks different now as it did when we were growing up. It's completely different, right?
Yeah.
So obviously we know that the conversation that we'd like to have, that we wish we had when we were a teenager, when we were younger, is gonna look different that we're giving our kids now. So yeah, as we kind of like wrap up, is there any other like last thoughts about our comfort level when we talk about having the conversation with our kids about sex, sexual health, different approaches that we take?
I think there's not one right approach. There could be many approaches. And I think parents have to learn the lingo, watch the music videos. Because your kids may be talking about sex and you don't even know because it's a foreign language. So watch the videos, learn the lingo, and there's not one way. There could be different ways. Because I know all the lingo.
Yeah.
but they don't know.
A ladle?
Lingo, like lingo, like
certain words
like I heard truffle butter, so I have to Google it.
What's that?
What? See, she doesn't know what truffle butter is.
My kids are, come on.
Oh,
I don't have teenagers
you know
yet.
what truffle butter is?
I think so.
it's not a chocolate?
It looks like
I saw a
chocolate.
video about it on YouTube.
But you
and
have to
I
know-
regretted it.
Because I'm like, oh,
gosh.
truffle butter. I heard that's expensive and delicious.
Yeah.
No. So I think learning the lingo, and if you don't know, Google. There's like an urban dictionary. You Google it, and then so when they're talking, they don't know you know, and then you kind of say, well, truffle butter can get you sick, right?
Okay.
So for all the parents listening, Google truffle butter.
Okay.
I feel hopefully we all have a group of friends or family that we can talk to them first and be like, my child did this, how can I address this? Because your first instinct is going to be fearful, like, oh my gosh, my child is asking me this now.
Mm-hmm.
So the support system should hopefully be there from, you know, religious organization or friends, family,
Absolutely.
spouse.
Exactly. Yeah, I think as women, as mothers, potential mothers, aunts, sisters, whatever you are in your role, I think it's important to utilize the other women that we have within our own circles, and because like even this conversation right now is really great because like it gives me a whole range of tools to use in my conversations too, right? So as you said, like talking to a best friend or like your mom or an aunt or just someone that you trust and value their knowledge. I think that's so important because it's not just your own point of view. You want to make sure that the information and the conversation is really well rounded and it's inclusive, it's non-judgmental. So you kind of want to get a good feel as to what that looks like and different ideas and how to go about doing that. So yeah, I know that. Thank you so much for that point.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Google truffle butter.
And that too.
Oh, and Google toss my salad. I was in shock. I was like, oh, you just get a salad and toss it like a green
Gosh.
garden salad.
I know that's from back in the day though.
I've
never heard of it.
I've heard of that.
Right? And so when I Googled it, I'm like, what?
Yeah.
But just little things that you hear, you have to be in the know. You have to Google it.
That's
Listen
true.
to the songs, look at the lyrics, Google it.
Very, very true, yeah. Because something as simple as giving top,
What is it?
right?
Like
Like,
to Google it.
Come on.
so
There's
something,
so much.
a word like topic, you would never even think
No.
what it means, right?
But
so,
that's the homework. This interview is gonna have some homework. So
yes,
Google
so Google is your friend.
Google top truffle butter and tossing
Salad.
salad. But it's very important.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So thank you so much, ladies, for all of your input in terms of getting to know, you know, a potential partner. What are the things that we're looking for? You know, are we examining ourselves? Are we in a good place emotionally, physically to even have the conversation? We talk about having the conversation with our kids. Thank you so much for being open with some of the things that you've shared, your stories, your experiences, your opinions, your tips. And I'm hoping that everyone who's watching this also may learn something and continue the conversation around how we can prevent HIV/AIDS from spreading. And it all starts with that conversation to begin with. So thank you so much for tuning in.